Such a startling way to start every time. Welcome to the second part of our Bible study on the flood narrative in the biblical text, which is Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Last week, we gave very much an overview of the flood narrative, and tonight we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. We will start with a couple of different ways of looking at it as an overview, but then we will engage the details of the text a little bit. And I'm going to ask you to pay attention as we do this initial part, where we're kind of talking about the broad strokes and maybe reading some of the passage itself, to generate some questions so that we can have more conversational element this evening and less of me just talking at you. So before we dive in, let me just open it up for half a second. Are there any lingering questions from last week, or comments or snide remarks that we want to make as we're jumping in?
I got a comment.
Yes.
It was strange after our Monday session.
Mm-hmm.
I kept hearing about Noah's Ark the rest of the week, which is like really weird because I never heard Noah's Ark since I was probably a little kid. But I was watching a TV show that I will leave nameless just in case somebody wants to watch it, and they discussed Noah's Ark, a part of this show. And what was cool, I felt so boss because he started talking about Gilgamesh, and I'm like, I know who that is. And this concept, and it was weird because they shared this part of that. I don't know if it was factual, they can change these, but the story of Noah being this bad guy. So I guess he was upset with humans. So what he did was he talked to God and asked God to send the flood, which God did. And I was like, I didn't hear about that from Gilgamesh, but I wanted to kind of put that out there to see if have you heard anything about that?
No, that doesn't sound familiar to me. From the biblical narrative or the ancient Near Eastern narratives. In all the ancient Near Eastern narratives, including the biblical narrative that I can think of, the flood always stems from a divine idea. Either God or the gods of the ancient Near East are the ones who initiate the idea. I can't think of a single one where the human actor is the one who initiates anything.
Yeah, I figured it was really strange. I'm like, why would God listen to a man? But of course, it is TV, so it did work with their plot to make Noah this bad guy. But I was just like, let me ask, see if there's anything out there.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's actually a really important thing. Because in one way, like a lot of these narratives are retelling of older stories, and they're repurposing them a little bit. Now, when it comes to the biblical text, the idea to my mind, is that any repurposing that's being done is for the greater purpose of like illuminating the character of God and his relationship, or God's relationship to humanity, and letting people know like who this God is and how we're supposed to interact with God. And so kind of retelling a story in that way doesn't feel wrong to me. Doing it in a way that kind of pits God as the bad guy, that's not always good. Or in this case, it sounds like Noah's the bad guy and God's kind of a lackey. So it doesn't sound like a terribly innovative or interesting take to me. So, but thanks for bringing that up. It's really neat.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, well, let's jump in. Last season rather, we covered verses 1 to 4 with the Nephilim. You might recall these, they might be fallen angels or something like that. It's kind of hard to say. They kind of fit in their own category. So we're not going to cover them again here. The question then becomes, where do we start our story? So, for those who do not grow up kind of with a like an academic or even a semi-academic way of approaching a biblical text, most people think, oh, the chapter divisions are kind of the natural space to begin and end stories. And I mean, as we saw with Genesis 1, that doesn't quite work, right? Because Genesis 1 really kind of carries into the first few verses of chapter 2. Here again, it doesn't really properly seem to start with chapter 6, verse 1, because we have those 4 verses that are doing something slightly different to what follows in the flood narrative. But then the question is, does it properly start in 6 verse 5, or does it start in 6 verse 9? You know, I want to be honest, I think it's an important question as a general principle, but this is one of those muddy places where I'm not sure I can tease it apart. Most people seem to just start with 6 verse 5, but there are a couple of people who think that verses 5 through 8 really go with the Nephilim stuff previously. And they only start the narrative proper at 6-9. I don't know. I think it's one of those things where those few verses 5 through 8, can really, thematically, they're a bridge between what comes in 1 through 4 and what comes after. So I mean, you want to parse it one way and push it with the first verses, fine. You want to push it with the later verses, that's fine. As a general principle, I think it is important to know when things begin and where they don't, but like this is slightly muddy, and that's okay. So we're just going to start with like verse 5 and move on from there. Very big picture, reminder of what we're doing here. There are kind of 3 main elements to this story. God has a rationale for the flood, and he, in sending the flood, he saves Noah and Noah's companions, or family in this case, by having them embark into an ark. The second major element of this story is that God sends a flood which destroys the rest of the world, according to the story. We'll get back to that, right? The world, whatever that means in this case. And then the third thing is that the flood is over, and there's kind of the wrap up of the story, and God promises not to send another flood. So those are the 3 major elements of this, if you kind of want to do this in a 3-act play, so to speak. One of the interesting things, and I'm going to share the screen here if I've got this. Oh, I've got a JPEG somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. I really wanted, oh no. I know it's here somewhere, and I apologize. I thought I had this one up. Where is it? This makes for riveting watching, doesn't it? I really thought I had this one. It makes for a really good... Oh, I know where it is. Haha. See, sometimes you just got to get moving here. Here we go. This is worth it, I promise. When technology just refuses to work with you. Here we go. Finally. Okay, so I want you to see this because there is an interesting chiasmus in this story. Now, I mentioned that briefly in the previous season about chiasmus being like something that you have element A and then element B, and then often it reverses into element B, but modified, and then A modified. And that's a very simple chiasmus. This is one of the most intricate versions of this that you often see. So this is what's known as an extended chiasmus that runs through the entire arc narrative. And so I'm going to share the screen. All right. I am hopeful that you are seeing this. What has been shown is that there's a lot of parallelisms between each element of the flood narrative, starting from this transitional introduction. Whoever kind of created this chiasmus structure started with 6 verse 9. So there's this transitional introduction, which is paralleled by the conclusion that comes out of it. You can see at the bottom. Those are both in white in the outermost shells, right? Then in this kind of teal or cyan color, we have violence in creation, which is kind of this next step that is paralleled right before the end with this fourth divine speech, where we have God proclaiming the covenant to Noah and his commitment to not send another flood. This third layer is the first divine speech, which is God's resolution to destroy the earth. And that's paralleled near the end with his resolution to preserve order. So you see a nice balance there. Everything is kind of bookending things. The second divine speech, which we see in yellow, is the speech saying from God to Noah saying, enter the ark. And that's paralleled with the third divine speech, which says, you may leave the ark. And then in this pinkish color, we have the beginning of the flood and then the drying of the earth. And again, in white, we have the rising flood and the receding flood. And this is all balanced so that we get at the very center, at the very heart of the story, this sentence that says, God remembers Noah. So I wanted you to see this structure because it's a lot better to see it with some of these colors, because you can see the parallelism kind of going in and kind of coming back out of that. Was that clear to all of you? Were you able to see it okay? Good. I like that one. I think it's very helpful to see what somebody is trying to communicate in this parallelism. But I'm going to show you one more because it happens again in this notion of numbers. Okay, so let me share this screen again. What we see here is that the numbers also kind of parallel one another. We have 7 days of waiting for the flood, followed by a second 7-day waiting period, followed by 40 days of the flood occurring, the waters rising, 150 days of the water triumphing. I guess that means it's going crazy and the water is kind of winning over nature. And then 150 days of the water waning. And then you get 40 days of waiting after the waters have receded. And then Noah starts sending out the birds and you get a 7-day wait period and then a second 7-day wait period. So I think what this is really showing us, we could make too much of this in trying to suggest that this is some sort of scientific thing. It's not. This is narrative art. This is the author just trying to demonstrate that there is this parallelism in the text, and that this parallelism for the author is a way of kind of showing how God orders things, and God has a very regimented, very orderly way of controlling the universe. And this matters quite a bit to the author, or at least one of the authors of this passage, because I think I hinted at this last week, that this is a unique passage in that effectively the story is told twice. And they're told if you tease it apart, you can almost see the story told completely through 2 times. Now, there is, of course, some people who doubt that this is the way it goes, but it pulls apart nicely enough that there might be something to this theory, right? And according to this theory, 1 is known as the J source, which is the Yahwistic source, which one of the elements of the J source is that it uses the name of Yahweh. Why J? Because in German, Yahweh starts with the J. But also the J source is really that really great storyteller. So the J source tells good stories. This is what we see in several places throughout throughout Torah. The other source is P, and that's the priestly source. And the priestly source is really concerned about showing order in the universe. And that's where some of these numbers come from, is this P source. You might, if you had to guess, you might figure one of the passages we've already covered in the last season is also a P source. And any guesses, like if you want to hold up a number, like which chapter of Genesis is the P source that we've already covered? Yes, 1. I saw a 4 in there, but not in this case. 1 is the one because it talks about day 1 happens, day 2 happens, day 3 happens. And it's really that kind of trying to say the whole universe was created in this highly structured way. And so the P source is usually thought to have written Genesis 1. So there we go. I want to now show you the 2 sources pulled apart. So one more time, I'm going to have to hide this screen or share the screen. There we go. So the Yahwist source. Now this is, like I said, they've been teased apart. And what we think is the J source and what we think is the P source, telling entirely complete stories of the flood. So let me read just a little bit from the Yahwist. Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So Yahweh said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of Yahweh. That's the beginning. Now, the P source has a very different way of beginning the story and wants to assure you that this is that there is order to this. So it starts with, these are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. And this is how you're going to make it, etc., etc. So that's the way it begins. If we bounce back to the Yahweh source, we get that little encounter with God and Noah in a slightly different way. It says, then Yahweh said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are alone, that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, etc., etc. I'm not going to read this all, but I want you to just take a moment, if the screen is big enough for you, to scan through this and see how it's really parallel, and the whole story is told twice. Just scan it on the screen if you can, and then we're going to look at the actual biblical text. You notice here, it's the kind of introductions about getting the animals will come, and Noah did everything that was commanded of him. Here in the P source, we have this really extensive, I shouldn't say really extensive explanation of how Noah's meant to build the ark. And then it takes a little longer to get to all the living things that are out there I will bring to you. Then here we go in the Noah, in the J on this side here, talks about who is going in. And after 7 days, the flood came on the earth. And Yahweh shut the family in. And the flood continued for 40 days, etc., etc., etc. Okay, now the P source on the other side is still continuing. Takes a little longer to get into the flood, but it's Noah was this old and all the clean animals came, and this is when it started. Rain from heavens, end of 40 days, etc. The J story is a little shorter. And on the P, on the same day, they went in, all the animals came in, and the flood started. Okay, and then sending out of the animals, etc., etc. And Noah, after the flood ends, Noah builds and does a sacrifice to Yahweh. And then there's the kind of promise of the continuation of the earth. And the P ends with the water swelled and they eventually end. And he starts sending out birds. And then...
Hey, Corey?
Yes.
Where did you... I see that this is a PDF. Is this something that's like easily findable online?
Might be. I mean, the problem with this kind of stuff is there's a lot of these things. This particular one, I did find online. I will share it in the chat here in a moment.
Okay. And are you aware of any like academics that you respect that have a book that does a good breakdown of the Bible in this format, or of some of the Torah in this format?
Not like a book. Most books do not, I mean, they might spend a chapter on it, but there wouldn't be a whole book on this particular part. I can think of an article or two, and I'll have to kind of find the reference to it. But this is one of those things where there's a lot of discussion about how exactly to tease it out. And, let me go ahead and just share this now in the chat, because I've kind of showed you what I want to show.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. The thing that is important, I think, about this, here we go. Let me get the chat up. And I'm going to include this file from my computer. There we go. You should all be able to see that now if you want to pull that down. Now, the thing for me is less the specific division, exactly what goes into J and what goes into P, but rather the notion that this story seems to be told almost entirely twice. Yeah, there are differences between the two. One focuses on a raven, the other kind of seems to focus on a dove. The amount of backstory is more rigorous and specific in the P source than it is in the J source. How long they're in the ark is different, and I'm not worried about the details as much as I'm saying like the characterization of it. If you look at your biblical text, I think you will see, like if you read through this, you will just see that it kind of goes, like it seems to repeat itself over and over, because it will say these things over and over. I'm going to need to pause for half a second. You'd think I'd learn. I need water when I sit down to do this. Okay, here we go. So if you're reading through Genesis 6 through 9, basically it feels highly repetitive, in part because it's these two stories that have been interwoven to one another. Okay? All right. So there are kind of all these parts to the story that each narrative seems to have. They each have a reason for the flood. They each have a moment where God is commanding Noah to build and enter the ark. There is the flood rising and kind of being in the midst of the flood. There's the flood receding. There is eventually dry land and Noah leaving the ark. And then there's God's covenant. And then one special extra part that's like slightly separate from this whole thing is this weird story of Noah's nakedness being seen by his sons. Okay, so let me pause right there. Have I generated any questions in your minds, or has this text generated any questions in your minds? No questions. Okay, good. That's the flood. Good night, everyone. All right. So let's go ahead and start just going through the text. As we look at this first part, the reason for the flood, we notice that it says, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. So one of the things that a lot of people emphasize, several commentaries that I was looking at, emphasize this notion that what the author is intending to show is that God does not act arbitrarily, right? God is, or the author is kind of building the case for God why this action is warranted. And that's slightly different to the other ancient Near Eastern narratives of the flood, for instance. Enlil, in the Atrahasis narrative, seems to just kind of do it on a whim because he's annoyed. I mean, I guess that's a rationale for sending the flood, but it's pretty flimsy, right? And I believe it's Ea or Enki, depending on the version, right? Calls him on it and kind of says, like, that's no reason to wipe out the earth just because you can't get a little sleep. So what this text is really kind of trying to show is that God has a good reason for doing this. And this is one way of kind of absolving God from the guilt of the problem of wiping out the earth, or at least that's the attempt. And remember, right, we don't want to evaluate with our modern or postmodern criteria that says it's still kind of a bad thing to do. In the ancient mind, they were saying this is justified because look at how bad humanity was. All right. Notice that it says in Genesis 6:6, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Have any of you ever encountered that particular verse before? Like, has this caused issues? No, I see some no's and I see some yeses, right? Because part of it depends on the context in which we have engaged these texts, right? There are a lot of people who have a hard time of thinking, where it says the Lord was sorry, sometimes the text will say the Lord regretted that he created humanity. And that seems to impart a certain emotionality, or for many people, it's a lack of omniscience. Like, if God created everything, he should have known that this would have happened. And so God can't regret something he does, because if God regrets something he does, that kind of very humanesque. That's a great point. Several texts raised the word, which is anthropopathic, meaning like human emotions. So that seems to perhaps be in the J source, and that's a suggestion, which is like J really tells a story where God is very much like humanity. And for J, and part of the biblical narrative, like the idea that God has human-like, human-esque feelings is not a big deal, right? God is just like a bigger, better version of humans, but it's going to feel things in the same way that humans would. Now, when you get later understandings of theology, when we start throwing around those big words like omnis, right? The omnipotent and the omniscient and all the all-knowing, all-powerful things, then you come back to these stories, you might have a problem with it. And so I tend not to do that, right? I tend to try and just read the story on its own terms and say, the story kind of says he regrets it. So I want to take that at face value. Whatever that means. But
And
notice, go ahead.
The omnis being like communicated in like the text being read with all those omnis in mind seems very like non-biblical in a way. It's like reading God. If God is God, God must be these things. So then we need to go back and read the Bible and kind of translate everything under this philosophical idea of what God must be like. Yeah. And not letting the text speak for itself about who God is and how he responds to the world.
That's how I view it, right? Which is one of the reasons why I'm very reluctant to kind of throw up those big words and put God into these categories of saying God is like this. Therefore, when we read this, we must understand it that way. I really just want to read the text in a certain way and allow that to generate feelings. Now, having said that, the people who hold those descriptions of omnipotent and omniscient dear, they would say they're getting that from other parts of the text, and that should influence the way we read this part of the text. So while I disagree with kind of reading that onto this spot, you know, they're claiming it's not eisegesis in the way that, you know, I might say, oh, let's be careful, right? So I want to be generous about somebody who reads it differently than I do on a topic like this, but yeah, that's not how I see it. And your explanation is a good way of putting my point of view on this. Yeah. Notably, at the second half of Genesis 6:6, it does say God was grieved in his heart, right? Again, so very anthropomorphic language here about God having a heart and being grieved. Yes. Again, this is to emphasize the note that God was doing this out of sadness as opposed to out of anger, right? Again, it's kind of trying to provide this rationale for God not punishing the earth so much as saying, like, this can't stand. And so it's with sadness that God does this to the early earth and not punishment per se. Not quite the same as a parent saying, you know, spanking their child and saying, this hurts me more than you. No, not quite like that. Notably, it continues in verse 7 again. I am sorry that I've made them. It's just re-emphasizing this. We get to verse 8 and it says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. One of the things that's just a small, interesting thing about that detail is Noah is in Hebrew spelled basically with two letters, a nun and a chet. So his name is Noah. But favor are those same two letters in the opposite order. It's a chet and a nun. It's Noah found chen in the Lord's eyes. I don't think there's anything super significant about that because that's a very common phrase, but I'm sure like the author noted this and wanted to kind of play up that notion. Let's see. What are some other things that are interesting here? I think we've mentioned it at the end of chapter 5. Noah's like the 10th generation from Adam. That's kind of cool. I don't know. Here we go. Now, where is it? In verse 9, Noah is known as blameless in his time. It's this word tamim, blameless. And the idea is that this is usually used of animals as being without defect in order to be proper animals for sacrifice. Does that make sense? Right. So if you're going to offer an animal for sacrifice, they need to be without defect. And so Noah has this adjective descriptor of him. He is blameless in this case. Now, this is not, of course, to say that he is sinless, but rather that he is kind of, some people think that a better translational option might be Noah is wholesome, as opposed to like perfect, something like that. Does that make sense? Okay.
In verse 7, why do you feel, or are there any thoughts about why everything outside of humanity also was regretted by God? Like what did they do to warrant the things that we did?
Yeah, they're the innocent bystanders in this whole thing, I think, right?
It's the evil giraffes, right, Corey?
Right.
The ones that ate more leaves than they should.
So that's an Eddie Izzard reference, right? So Eddie Izzard is a comedian who often talks about religious things and has a very long bit about the flood. And I encourage you to find her comedy specials and watch them. They are very funny.
And warn them about the language.
The language is bad. She's British, so she swears a lot.
And on that particular one, she was not.
Or,
Right.
yeah, she has changed her pronouns recently. But the language is either bad or it's good, depending on your outlook.
And we will. I actually want to come back to this very point for closer to the end. But it is interesting, right? And I think that part of this is. I think this is the part where we wrestle with what this story is doing in the biblical text. Because if this is trying to do theology, you really do have to wrestle with what's going on here. Why are the animals and the earth being punished for humanity's take? But if what we're doing here is having a story that exists in the cultural memory of the people in the ancient Near East, and now we're repurposing it to tell a story about God, then perhaps every detail wasn't worked out when that repurposing happened, right? So it's kind of known by everybody that there was this flood, but these people over here tell it like this, and we want to tell it like this because we think it gives a better understanding of who this God is that we worship, right? And the very point is, where is the word used? Where does it say the flood? Because, at some point here, it does say literally the flood. God said the flood, ha-mabul. And the definite article there seems to be somewhat suggestive, right? Definite articles typically are utilized in order to say, I'm talking about a particular noun, in this case, flood, and you know which one I'm talking about, and I know which one I'm talking about. So we're all on the same page, right? Let the dog out. Which dog? The dog that always wants out, right? The dog. When it mentions the flood, it seems to be referencing something that is in cultural memory. Now it's being repurposed to tell a story about Yahweh, which again means if that's what this is doing, then some of these details are less like we have less of an ability to unpack all these details to find out something that actually happened, or something that describes very precisely the nature of God, and more like this is a generality that we should be understanding and taking. Does that make sense? I have to be honest, like as I was reading through a lot of these details and a lot of these commentaries, like I don't know if this will stay in the recording, right? I got bored. I just flat out got bored of reading all these details and what some people wanted to make of these details in their commentaries about what this says and who that, you know, like coming from a guy who has made it his career to study the Bible, I couldn't be bothered with some of these things because I felt like they're taking the wrong message from it. So that, my opinion, that not everyone here has to agree with me. If you have specific questions, I'm happy to engage those details. But like for me, I just kept thinking we're making too much of some elements and, you know, not enough of others.
I think part of the other thing is to think through like when it was being like compiled, right? If this is either in the exile or post-exile, then you have a people group who have been like swept away from their land, and in their mind it's a result of sin, but yet they still are having hope towards restoration. And I think that weaves throughout these like early narratives in Genesis, because we have like time after time where there's like sin, punishment, and with some symbol of hope, right? Like Cain and Abel, there was murder, he was ostracized or kicked out, but the hope is that he's not gonna die, he's given the mark. So yet here's another one, we've got the flood, there's sin, prevalent sin all across the land. You know, the punishment is like God is starting new, but the hope is that he's not wiping everyone away, he's saving Noah. So I think that for me it kind of comes back to like keeping in mind the exile in reading this narrative.
Between last week and this week, you know, this came up last week too, this parallel to the exile, and I don't think I've actually read it anywhere. That's not to suggest that it doesn't exist, right? But I don't recall in any of the commentaries that I'm reading, which maybe it's not their point, but this backdrop of the exile just feels more and more salient to the conversation of the flood narrative. Right, the flood is a metaphor for what we're experiencing being in exile. And just as Noah kind of survived and got out of it, and there's this new covenant, oh my gosh, please let this happen to us again, right? Mm-hmm. This is a way of explaining the flood narrative that really feels powerful and has some potential for me. I wonder if other people have written on this. I haven't seen it yet. I'll need to dive.
I'm going to be honest. I think Pete Enns has written on that.
Has he?
Yeah, I think so.
That would be great because, you know, I haven't read a lot of Pete Enns' work, but you know, I'm going to write this down because I want to track that down. If he or anyone else has done it, I mean, it makes so much sense. And you know, especially when you think about how so much of the Deuteronomistic history is told from that backdrop, why wouldn't it also happen with a book like Genesis, where it receives its final form right there, you know, in that 6th century as the exile is happening? Okay, so kind of cycling back just to the text itself. God commands Noah to build and enter the ark. I don't know what's interesting here. The ark is the only other time that the word ark is used is the same ark that Moses has put in, like that basket that he's put into the river. And it seems to suggest that there's like no control over the people of the people in the ark over the ark. And therefore, this is to emphasize how whoever is inside the ark is kind of completely at the will of God. They've got no control. They're just at God's mercy. You might know that there is something called the no rudder, exactly. There is another ark in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant, for instance, but that that ark is a different word in Hebrew. So that's Aron versus, which is the Ark of the Covenant, and then it's Teva, which is the kind of same as the ark here for Noah and Moses. One interesting, again, large scale thing here that I found really fascinating is once the flood starts, this is different from in the biblical narrative than it is to the ancient Near Eastern narratives. Once the flood starts, all the action takes place outside the ark, right? Our flood hero no longer is really an active participant, and all the narrative is told from the perspective of what's going on out in the flood. Whereas, you know, in the ancient Near Eastern ones, there's my puppy. The flood heroes have some agency still. All right. We get to the center, and I want to take us right there to Genesis 8:1. Genesis 8:1 represents this very center of the entire story, right? It says, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. So it uses this word remembered. In modern terms, or at least in Western English terms, when we say remembered, it's kind of, there's not always agency in that. It's kind of like something hits you, like, oh, I remembered where I put my keys. But remember in this case is much less of that kind of outside factor happening to God and much more about God choosing to recall or bring back to mind the fact that Noah was righteous among his generation, and therefore he chose to act. And this again is part of the author emphasizing like God's agency over the flood itself, right? In the other ancient Near Eastern ones, the gods are scared of the flood, that it's even a little bit iffy for them. But for Noah, for the biblical narrative, God remembers Noah and says, all right, time to shut it down. And so he sends a wind over the earth and the water subsided. So this is all about the strength and power and of God to say, the earth responds to me. Does that make sense? We all good? The ark ends up landing on Mount Ararat, which is in eastern Turkey. So that's kind of weird, especially for like Israelites to mention that detail. Like why would the ark land in a place that's kind of so far from their homeland? But you know, there you go. That seems to suggest that this is built on having been borrowed from another culture. All right. I could go through more and more details, but let me just ask the question, like, what does this do for us as modern, postmodern people of faith? Like, what does this story here do to us or for us? Like, how do we, all the things I've shared in, 2 hours of talking about the flood, what does it do to or for us?
I feel like our main modern focus when I hear about it, and maybe, more recently I hear about it more in academic sources and stuff. So I am hearing more of what we're talking about today. But I think just in my historical growing up, it's mostly getting down to the covenants and getting to the parts of, God's covenant with humanity. And so I think that's more stressed. The stress point kind of comes down to the rainbow and to the promise and to this idea of restoration and and that kind of a thing. So I think, at least for me, that's what I've seen most pointed there. We have this idea that, God's not going to do that again. So I guess it seems irrelevant to some level, because we don't okay, even if God was like this at one point, he's not like this anymore, or he's vowed not to necessarily do this. So we have nothing to worry about. We have a promise. And then, obviously for a little bit more doom and gloom, you might be able to say, well, he destroyed the earth with water, but he won't destroy the earth again with water. Dun dun dun. Like he's going to do this again, but it just won't be with water next time. But yeah, I think as a postmodern reader that's trying to help reconstruct how we've learned a lot of this, I think that is where being able to see these ideas and concepts of exile, concepts of restoration, concepts of the remnant, and all of those little pieces, I think, are just things that I begin to read into it or carry out of it. So yeah.
Anyone else? I mean, I think that's a very good point, Chris. Anyone else want to launch into that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
You go, Karen.
Cop. My bad for holding my phone. Sorry. Anyway, I am very interested in this section, specifically talking about the flood, because it was only recently that I even discovered some of the flood language as it related to armies of people, and so that was just really, really interesting, just some of the language that's been used as the Lord was allowing a certain people group to take over, similarly to a flood. So I'm just really paying close attention to a lot of the language that's being used here, the chiasm. I'm just really intrigued by all of this. So that's why I have nothing to say, because it's not interesting, except for the fact that I'm just really interested in really looking at this in depthly. I have no more to contribute.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, groups of people, like armies. Floods were a metaphor for armies, as were locusts. In fact, the Assyrian army is often compared to locusts, but floods makes a lot of sense. And as we talk about if and when we get to the Exodus narrative, the idea of water being an agent of God over and against Israel's enemies becomes very prominent. So the whole notion of flood and water and being utilized by God is very important. Yeah. Jim, you had something?
Yeah, I was going to say that it sets us up, though, sets the stage that we need intervention. We need help. It begins to set the stage for, I think, for the Messiah to come. It begins to paint a picture of humanity going in directions, and to the point where the whole world need a restart button. And even the things that follow that isn't going to be good enough, that eventually it's going to take God's presence in our face to be able to make any difference at all.
Yeah. That is thinking about this story through that lens reminds us that this kind of happens a lot, right? There are so many of these stories, and Judges is that whole cycle happening over and over again, of the notion that humanity's not getting it right, and God's got to send someone, or God's presence needs to be around, be imminent, so that we can hit that reset button. And sometimes it looks big and sometimes it looks small, but we're kind of messed up on a lot of fronts, and we need the regular intervention of the divine presence.
And to the point where even when he intervenes the way he did, talking about the flood or taking his people out of Egypt, any of those things still didn't get us to the point good enough that we would get it right and trust and develop our relationship with our Creator, that we needed his presence pointing toward Jesus to actually be with us to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Go
going
ahead.
to ask just, to that point, how we should take the, kind of the conclusion. And I think it's different in the Hebrew. Oh, yeah. So where it says like, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, since the imaginings of a person's heart are evil from his youth, nor will I ever again destroy all living things as I have done. And so it's just this idea of, even it seems as though the caveat in that statement, I am at 8:21, I believe.
Right.
Just this idea that the reason that I won't do this again is because it doesn't solve the problem of the human heart, or something to that effect. And then, of course, we know this because of personal experience. We live in a world where we see the hearts of humanity, and like, am I supposed to think that it's not? We're not, even though things are bad, it's no way in comparison to something that we could have assumed what it was like in Genesis 6, or that it may get like this again, but God's remedy is different, or because we have Jesus, he's already sent the solution to the problem of humanity, and its evilness or wickedness or whatever. So just kind of where do we go with this idea of what did it solve, and how are we supposed to see the current humanity, like evil of humanity or whatever, just the wickedness of the heart and that kind of thing.
That's interesting. I think a couple things come to mind, and I don't know that I'll address everything you just mentioned, but like one thing that comes to mind is that very verse in 8:21. I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the evil of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never destroy. Like you mentioned, this idea that God says, I won't do this again because really it kind of doesn't solve the actual problem. And that to me seems to suggest it's a reminder that these stories are told a long way after the events that they're purporting to talk about. Because what that would suggest is, right, like, how would God know immediately after the flood that it had no effect, right? Or more specifically, how would an author writing at that moment know that God knew that thing, right? There needs to be some time that's passed to show that, yeah, that didn't work. That didn't solve anything, because here we are again acting evil, and God's still good, but he hasn't killed us. So, I mean, I think there's that reminder that there's that different distance between the telling of the story and the events that it's telling about. I think that's one thing. But to try and keep this in the mind of the ancient author, I think that is actually part of the point, is the notion that God chose not to do this again, right? And that alone is a rationale for remaining faithful to God, is the fact that when that happened, God did that, but he didn't do it again. And therefore we can trust that God is working in different ways with something that is more to our immediate benefit than kind of the global reset button.
Yeah.
So how does that work for us? I mean, I think that's one of those cases where the perspective of the ancient author and our perspective can line up nicely, right? Because it's kind of just like, even more time has passed and God hasn't done that. So like, maybe there is something to lean into. God continues to find new and creative ways to break us out of that cycle of our depravity and our need for God's presence to kind of reset and do life better.
Last really random controversial question as you're speaking, just for fun, because Kiri's not here. I figured someone's got to do it.
Someone's got to do it.
As I think we talked a little bit about it last week, but on this idea of it being a possible local flood, or likely improbable, just from data and stuff like that we have. If we were to suggest that there is some historicity and this has to do with some form of a local flood, and we do say that there's theological things that we can take from this, what are our thoughts on other local floods? Because those things have happened since this time, or even in like modern floods where maybe they're not biblical, but they're pretty dang close to biblical of proportions. And then even some people seem to suggest that there are moral implications and all of that kind of thing attached to it. And obviously I don't like to prescribe to those things, but of course someone was able to do that at a time. And what license do we have to be able to make such claims in a modern setting? I don't know if you ever thought about that, but just as a
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So as a person who believes in God and believes that God is kind of whatever God is, God's self. And if the omni words are important, that's fine. But God is somehow powerful, right? Much more powerful than we. In general, I'm reluctant to suggest that God is micromanaging climactic, climate-related events. It's not. I don't think God is micromanaging sending floods and earthquakes and all those kinds of things. I'm sure I fall somewhere in between a God who micromanages all those things and somebody who's like saying watchmaker God who made the world and just set it spinning and hands off, right? I'm somewhere in between those two poles, but I don't know that I can carefully say like, I'm not sure I could put myself specifically on a place on that spectrum, right? Because I do believe that a lot of the things that are happening are the result of the natural order that God set up. But I'm not suggesting that God is then 100% hands off. So, when there's a flood nowadays, or there's something like Hurricane Katrina, like there is not one part of me that thinks that was God sent that to punish the people of New Orleans or America in general or anything like that. I think that is horrifically abusive theologically to say those kinds of things. And I know people did say it. I also think that, not to make everything about race, but I think there's probably some element of the African American dominant culture in that area as an excuse to use theological language of, God sent this to abuse, see, those people deserved it. I think there was probably a racist element to that kind of language. Did I address most of the points you?
Yes. No, I just, as I'm thinking of local floods and that whole picture, that was kind of where I was going. No one's thinking about this on a broad scale of ever happening, again. But like, could we say the same thing about this? Like, if there's a point that's being made in this story, like we wouldn't call that abusive, and yet if it's being made today, we would be like, yeah, back off though. Like, also, why would you want to put God on that? And right. So it's interesting that,
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, yeah, I think you get where I'm at. I also agree with you. So it's just it's one of those things as I'm challenging that thought.
So if I were to kind of wrap that part up, I mean, I think that the ancient Near Eastern flood narratives potentially do go back to that flood that happened roughly 2900 BCE in Kish, Shurupak, or whatever it was called. And some story got attached to it. And the narratives of the gods controlling that story happened. And that became a clear marker in the cultural memory of a lot of people. And as that story got spread around, eventually the Israelites became aware of this story and they repurposed it. So like for me, like I think that in this case, that lets God off the hook of having done, like sent the flood to destroy all humanity. And we use it for the purpose of the story to say, this is what the ancients thought God was like had God been involved in the story. Of course, they believed it was absolutely real, right? It's in their cultural memory. So I think that's where we go with it. Does anyone have any comments? Because I want to bring up one other point before we call it a night. So, you know, we mentioned Eddie Izzard before, and I think it's a joke, right? But there's a reason it's funny, because there are so many clear holes in the story that remind us that this is not, you know, a scientific explanation of what a global flood would look like, right? And if God's purpose is to destroy all creation, like what do you do with ducks who can just float, right? That's Eddie Izzard's jokes. Like what about all the fish? What about all the you know, evil ducks who can get away with it and they're not destroyed because they can just simply float, right? So there's this, for me, that's the jokes that Eddie Izzard is making about the flood narrative is this reminder that it just doesn't cohere as a scientific explanation. And that's where the idea of a narrative that is borrowed and repurposed really finds some gravity with me. So I don't know. Other thoughts, questions, comments, snide remarks?
What about the ducks?
They're evil ducks.
The giraffes that have eaten more leaves than they should, they're the evil giraffes, but
Right.
you know, not the floating and the swimming ones.
Right.
No, for real, everyone should watch it because it's amazing and hilarious and fantastic. I know I'm like a broken record. Sorry, my child is yelling in the background. I know I'm like a broken record the past few weeks about how much I love us and I love our church and I just like the flood is one of my favorite Bible stories, genuinely. Like I love the story of Noah, the animals. Like I think it's so fun and like a horrible, macabre kind of way, right? Like it's awful that everybody dies and whatever. But I loved the like animated little, you know, the like animals 2x2 into the ark. And like I played with Noah's Ark when I was a kid and I always loved the story. But like since kind of coming to a more like that doesn't make any sense scientifically type of spot, it makes me sad. Like it's a sad story, right? Like it's just like, oh, well, this couldn't have happened. So what is this even about? And then you're just like, well, and this narrative was already a thing. And so maybe I'm going to shut up now. I'm gushing, but it makes me so happy.
Well, I think it's important to realize that I think there are a lot of people who look at this story and want it to explain things that it's not trying to do. And they want to be able to explain all the details, which I think is one of the reasons why I personally get really bored of it, because I think like it's just not doing that. And for me, this is one of those clear moments where we really need to try and get back to what the ancient authors are attempting to accomplish and not try and hold them to standards of centuries of theological discussion that follow it. Like the key moment for us being like, we're looking at it going, how horrible is it that God would send a flood to kill everything on the earth? And that's our standard because of centuries of theological discussion. But back then they were just kind of like, yeah, no, it was our God who controls big bad things. Like, So it was a big bad thing, but like, no, it was our God. So like our God is strong and our God is powerful. And the fact that they didn't stop and kind of get where we are 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, like we can't criticize them, but we also can't look for what is important to us in every story in the biblical text. So I think that's one of the values of the flood narrative from a modern faith-filled critical perspective, right? It is doing something. It is telling us that there's a God who loves us and wants to commit to the reset button in a way that is not catastrophic anymore. But it also has limits on what it's communicating. So if there's any takeaway, it's kind of that. So that's my takeaway.
Much less important, but I did put the link in. I found the shortened version that pulls out just the Noah's Ark bit. It's only 6 minutes if you want to have a communal experience. Corey can screen share.
Are we going to do this then? Shall we?
I mean, I would stop the recording at that point.
I need to stop the recording because I don't want any problems here. So we'll call it a night. Next week, we're going to continue with, we're actually going to talk about 2 chapters, Genesis 10 and 11. So Genesis 10 is known as the Table of Nations, and Genesis 11 kind of wraps up the mythology section of Genesis. And so that's going to be a nice kind of cap point for what we've accomplished to that point. So I will explain the Table of Nations. It seems boring. It's really cool. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say for now. So until next week, and next week we will be brought to you live from Las Vegas. And that's not a joke. Amy and I will be doing this from a hotel room in Las Vegas. So
are you going to get crazy?
No? That's likely.
Absolutely. I'm taking all the kids clubbing till at least midnight.
Yeah. So,
although, the cool clubs don't even open till 11.
That's right.
I support it.
All right.
And that's what's recorded. We're kidding, recording.
All right. There it is.